We'll begin. Well, welcome all. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School of the University of Chicago, and it is a joy to welcome you virtually to our campus. I will acknowledge that right now there are clouds overhead, so it's not quite as gorgeous as it is pictured here, but all of the trees and beautiful buildings are there, even if a little less sunlight than usual at this hour. And we show this because we welcome people as part of the Graham School to the extraordinary resources and ideas of this great university. We are one of the founding divisions of this university since 1890, when the university was founded, because William Rainey Harper wanted this to be a university where ideas went out into the world and shaped people's understandings of the world. And so for more than 130 years, we have been trailblazing new paths in lifelong learning. And we've had extraordinary instructors like Chris Jones in our classroom bringing those ideas to life. I'll just share that today we have 4 main programs that people reach through the Graham School. A Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world that is now online, as well as with in-person opportunities. We have a basic program of liberal education where you can look at the timeless ideas that have shaped society. We have open enrollment, where the course that you're going to be hearing more about today can be found, where we look across all of the disciplines of the university, and we even bring people from far beyond the university to teach. And then we have annual programs. Indeed, later today, I'll be welcoming a group of attorneys who are looking at big questions of justice. And later this month, we will be welcoming people from around the world who are interested in the future of museum publishing. But the reason that you are here is not to hear about the Graham School in general. It is to hear very particularly about one upcoming course, and that is a course on Shakespeare in an Unforgiving 2023. And so I will bring up on screen Chris Jones. Chris, as you saw in the biography that we shared in advance, is an extraordinarily accomplished individual, not only because he is a teacher here at the Graham School, but also because he is a longtime theater critic and now the head of the editorial page at the Tribune. And one of the things he talks about is how theater is ultimately about culture and society, and that prepared him well for the role now of being the critic, not just of the theater, but of the entire world, so to speak, being on that page. And so it's a pleasure to welcome you, Chris. And these are always such exciting conversations for me because I love theater, but I know that I really only get the surface level as someone who's a non-expert. And so every time we speak, I feel like I go into my next show with such greater understanding, and it becomes even more enjoyable to be part of the theatric experience. So we're going to have a conversation about Shakespeare, and the Unforgiving 2023 references that, like many things that are iconic and were thought to be timeless, it is in a moment where it is being questioned and challenged. And I want to start by setting the table about Shakespeare's work before the recent years, because I want to talk about why originally the Bard has become so iconic and beloved. And, you know, in your view, as someone who has looked at theater and I imagine has, you know, always seen Shakespeare in that theater because of the role that he plays, especially in the English-speaking world. Let's start with why, in your view, has Shakespeare been so beloved for so long? And then we'll come into the current moment.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very honored again to be teaching at the University of Chicago, and it's just it's a really joyous part of my life in every way, and I really appreciate that. And I see a couple of my old students in joining this meeting. So hi to you guys, and it's great to see you again. This is a brand new course that I've put together, or I'm putting together more accurately, since we don't start until September. And I wanted to just say a big thanks about, you know, and just talk a little bit about what the course is going to involve. But, you know, answer to this question, I mean, the short answer to that question, I suppose, is that Shakespeare was the greatest playwright that ever lived and taught us more about being human than any other playwright. And when you add the fact that Shakespeare was highly prolific, wrote very many plays over the course of his life, and was able, because he lived by the standards of his times, I suppose, relatively long, he was able to reflect what a young man's concerns may be, what a middle-aged person's concerns may be, and maybe what the concerns of somebody who is older may be. All of those things were there. Now, if you compare him, say, to Christopher Marlowe, another playwright from that era who a lot of people really admire, Christopher Marlowe was killed in a tavern brawl in Deptford as a young person. And so had Christopher Marlowe lived, maybe he would have gone on to write as fine a body of work as Shakespeare. And I would say that about other writers too that have followed. I was recently reviewing Lorraine Hansberry's play, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, on Broadway just last year. And The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window was Lorraine Hansberry's sort of second major play after Raisin in the Sun. And she died essentially while it was in previews, just around opening night. And I am a big fan of Lorraine Hansberry's, who has great connections to Hyde Park, of course. And I always think to myself, had she lived, she would have been as good as Shakespeare. And I don't say that lightly, but I really do believe that to be the case in her case. So I think to some extent there was the accident of a good long life. He also had a commercial discipline about him, which is to say that he worked for a for-profit theater company that essentially needed new stuff all the time. He's a bit like me. I have to churn something out every day because there's a space in the newspaper. And it's not always good, I don't think, but it is done. And I think Shakespeare also had that sort of discipline of the marketplace that helped him too. He also knew the actors he was working with. So he wrote very specifically for a company of highly accomplished players who he was able to write for with a real kind of accuracy and passion, and who almost certainly suggested things. So I think all of those things are the obvious answers to the question, Seth. But let me just delve into one aspect of it that I think is sort of especially interesting and apropos of what you just asked me, and that is, I guess I would refer to the great Harold Bloom, the great humanist scholar and the great Shakespearean scholar, who essentially argued in one of his books that Shakespeare invented the human. Now, that sounds like an audacious, ridiculous claim in many ways. And I suppose it is an audacious, ridiculous claim, because we think, of course, about artists and writers as reflecting the human experience. We say that all the time. Shakespeare reflected what it was like to be human. But Bloom sort of raised the bar and essentially said, no, he didn't reflect what it was like to be human. He actually created what it was like to be human. And that was a sort of an interesting point. What he was really saying at that point, I think, is that Shakespeare was writing at the time of the birth of the sense of self. So a lot of Renaissance scholars say essentially that the idea of the I, the me as a person, me as a sense of self, really was a Renaissance creation. That idea of individual identity that's so central to the founding of this nation and to the way people think today was very much a Renaissance creation. And Shakespeare, who had a vocabulary in excess of 22,000 words, didn't so much reflect our personalities as give us the building blocks to create them. So Bloom argued that our modern sense of self really comes from Shakespeare. So if you say, I'm indecisive, or I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, those assertions, bear with me here, it's interesting. Those assertions are actually to some extent flowing from Shakespeare himself. Or let's say, I love my wife with unbridled passion. That's a statement, not that Shakespeare reflected that, but that actually gave us the ability to do that. And that when we say those things, excuse my dog barking, when we say those things, they come from our sense of, they come from Shakespeare's characters for the most part. That's what allows us to say the things that we say. And so that, I think, is very important. Shakespeare didn't just go further than anybody else in his accuracy of his exploration of human behavior, but he actually gave us the words, and he gave us the ideas to establish one for themselves. So it's that, I think, is, in short, Seth, what he did. It's the idea, the things that we say and things that we think we feel, to some degree he invented, because the Renaissance was so central in the invention of the Cartesian eye, the sense of self.
Well, so we're going to come to Shakespeare's critiques in a moment, but I want to set the scene one more time because we have this iconic, prolific playwright. And as you say, you know, there's even arguments out there that are not entirely laughable that he has this huge role in creating what it means to be human. And we're going to come to the critique, but I want to set up the scene because the critiques of Shakespeare are not for Shakespeare alone. There's a movement taking place, obviously, in the broader society where we are coming to terms and reckoning with many forms of discrimination and systemic biases. And those are leading to a lot of questions in theater at large. And so I'm curious if you can just paint a picture about what's happening in theater as we reckon with a number of social movements in society. And then I promise, for those who have come to hear about Shakespeare in an Unforgiving 2023, we're going to then combine these two and say what happens when this iconic figure meets these movements. But let's set the scene on the other side. What do these movements look like and where are they coming from?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, of course, in that is all being questioned. And I think that at the core of it is the notion of universality. So generally speaking, Shakespeare's defenders across the years, and if I look at my own life, having, you know, a person my age who's gone to Shakespeare his whole life, this is the argument I've always heard, which is that Shakespeare functions as essentially as not belonging to any particular gender, any particular race, any particular anything, but simply is universal and has an almost an ability to reflect the viewer back. Now, I believe some of that ability comes from, you know, I don't want to get too sidetracked into the famous authorship debate, which is always kind of an interesting one. But I do think the great Shakespearean actor Michael Pennington once said that Shakespeare, the lack of information about Shakespeare, the person, is an intentional act of self-effacement. So Pennington's argument was that Shakespeare essentially deliberately self-effaced. You know, that we know little about him because he wanted little to be known. Now, that's a controversial statement. Not everybody agrees with that, but I think it is what it is. There is some truth to it. So that, I think, is a key part of what of the answer to that question. So I think what we're seeing in the movement now is that people say, okay, he's not universal, that he reflected a very specific white European experience. And it's absolutely true that I think an argument can be made that Shakespeare was fundamentally conservative. I don't mean that politically conservative necessarily, but I think it's very difficult to look at all of Shakespeare's plays and say, here's a radical. And I attribute that partly to the political realities of the era. I mean, there's no question, for example, that he was typically on the side of the House of Lancaster, not of York, for the most part. There's no question that he was aware who was queen. He kind of had to be if he wanted to stay alive. So all of that, I think, you know, he was an expedient writer. And I think a lot of people now would say that the box office, which I just described as providing discipline for Shakespeare as a good thing, they would say was not a good thing at all, because it prevented him as a sort of it prevented him from, let's call it a more social mission. And I think Shakespeare also has come to represent a kind of, colonialist hegemony, if you like. And I think, you know, if you look at, say, many theaters in the US, if you look at, say, let's say the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, which is this great big theater in Minneapolis, as sure many people here know, that was founded by Tyrone Guthrie largely on the backs of this desire to present Shakespeare to the people of Minneapolis. You could argue that that was the wrong tactic, that what he should have been doing was reflecting the traditions of Minneapolis itself, the local people, the native people, instead of kind of importing this idea of what great theater was. Now, that he would not have understood that argument, I don't think, or he would have dismissed that argument more accurately. But that is, I think, an issue that today people are wrestling with more and more, Seth.
Well, so let's talk about how this is playing out in the world. And, you have seen that his works are now sometimes being taken out of theater, they're being challenged in educational curriculum or being reinterpreted. Can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing these challenges play out in terms of how now Shakespeare is showing up as someone who has been, very ubiquitous? I see that both as a person, I see that as a dad in my, kids' schools, but I also see change and kind of how, he'll fare as a question mark. And so I'm curious if you could just talk about what's happened to date, and then, as you look out, where you see some of these trends heading.
Well, it's a very, that's a very complicated question. And if we had, 6 weeks or 12, maybe 10 weeks of a course,
Yeah, you'll
could
have
answer
10
that.
weeks. So,
But I think some of the issues are that people are reading less Shakespeare. I think most young people I find now have read less Shakespeare than was true 20, 25 years ago. I think once you get beyond Romeo and Juliet, often you find people really don't know many of the plays anymore. So I think that's just a reality, that the position that Shakespeare once occupied on the curriculum is now shared with more writers. And I think that I'm not taking a position on that particularly either way. I think that's just a reality that's what's happening now. There are also people, what I would say, deconstructing the idea of Shakespearean tragedy. One of the hits on Broadway last season was a play called Fat Ham, which is a sort of a riff on Hamlet by James I. James. I hope to look at that in my course a little bit. And it looks at who is the hero. What is the Shakespearean hero that we recognize? Is it really, is Hamlet really a hero in the way that he's always been venerated? And what are the assumptions when we think of as a tragic hero? And Shakespeare largely followed what I would describe as fairly traditional notions of tragedy, drawing back all the way to Aristotle. And so I think people are often deconstructing now the gender implications of that. And Shakespeare is very much a sort of a contested space, I would say. There was a piece, I believe, in the New York Times just a few days ago, talking about Ron DeSantis's sort of censorship in Florida and how that was affecting Shakespeare. So that was sort of saying from the right. It was a left-leaning point of view, but it was saying that Shakespeare's interest in violence, for example, or in sexuality, is now running afoul of these ridiculous laws in Florida that are preventing all of that. So that's one side of it. And then on the other side of it, you've got, the Cambridge University Press has a series of books called Anti-Racist Shakespeare, which is dedicated to the idea that you have to change Shakespeare to make him more anti-racist, you might say. So in other words, what you find is that people on both sides of the political spectrum are looking at this figure and sort of, as people do, trying to assess to what degree does Shakespeare align with my views, or what I believe to be true, or what I believe to be good and right about the world. So we're beginning to see that, and I think that there was a lot of deference to Shakespeare for people, you're a little younger than me, Seth, but still true in your age group. That deference, I think, has gone. Like, I think the idea that Shakespeare is stands on a pedestal above all else is completely, I don't think that's true. And I think that's a very, very big change. And, there's a lot of other interesting arguments about, for example, should Shakespeare be rewritten? I mean, there are studies that say that people who go to Shakespeare only catch some percentage of the actual words that are being spoken. My kids they tend to watch TV shows with the subtitles on, and that's regular language. So we're asking audiences now at Shakespeare to really think about, to be able to deal with language that's much more difficult. So that's a whole other question. Should these plays be updated? Is it right to force people to this sort of language study?
And I mean, Chris, can I ask you how you think about that in the context of the fragmentation overall in society? Because it strikes me that there are very few, single iconic ideas left. There's been a lot written this summer about how Taylor Swift may be the only, in the music category that's able to achieve the dominance that was once achieved by many. But I mean, is that something that is unique here, or is that also part beyond the social movement of just the multiplicity of media and opportunities and the many niches that are now being formed? And so, in some ways, all their icons are meeting some type of, challenge from that movement.
Well, I think that's an accurate statement. I think there are very few shared. I think as a country, we're in this place where shared values are not as shared as they once were, and that there's no question about that. And since you're bringing up Taylor Swift, by the way, I would say her popularity is, and this is a very interesting. As a student of Taylor Swift, this is very interesting to me. Her popularity is very much based on her care for her fans, right? So
Right.
the thing about her is that she's very, very good at relating to people in a way, explicit way, completely uncommon in the music industry.
Yeah.
And there's always a lesson in there for the theater, which doesn't always do a very good job of that. That artists tend to go, well, here's my work, here's my play. She is a retail customer service person, and that is imbued in her art, and that I think has allowed her, as you say, to really transcend those kinds of different audiences. But I think that Shakespeare, now I would say Chris Jones's view is that we all still get old, we all still make mistakes, we all still get angry, we all still worry about our children. We all still deal with our parents. In some ways, it's illusory to say there are no shared values because we die in the same way. We're all aware that the people who are the greatest people don't live the longest. We see injustices. And I think probably plenty of us on this call think a lot about God and the existence of God. We think about mortality, and we think about love, and we think about all of these issues. And we also think about legacy and wanting to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And I would argue that it doesn't matter what your politics are, really, to appreciate that. It's very atmospheric here as the rain is going down outside my house. That Shakespeare actually did deal with those things, and they are universal. And the other thing I would say too is people are questioning now, the beauty of poetry, but even the notion of what is beautiful has really become a contested space. I mean, I wouldn't say that Shakespeare was not uniformly popular from the moment of his. So if you look at the trajectory of Hamlet from the moment Hamlet was written to now, it wasn't always at the top of the hit parade. Shakespeare has actually waxed and waned in popularity, and was certainly at a peak in the 20th century, I think. But I would say, if I'm being really frank, it has waned now, notably in my lifetime. And that is one of the things that I think is very interesting to think about.
We have a question from John Beale. How early was Shakespeare in the very existence of public theater in England? And I'm going to add an addendum, as if that's not enough for you to answer, Chris. Can you talk at all about the role that the printing press may have played as well? Because that coincided with Shakespeare. And so, in addition to being in the public theater movement in England, he also came of kind of writing at the time in which his work could be disseminated at a much higher level than previous playwrights.
That's true. That's absolutely correct. He did, and that, of course, the Renaissance in general was that era when everything exploded, with when people could explore new worlds, or new worlds to them at least, and that absolutely, that was all part of that. I think too. There's this, one of the issues in the authorship debate that often comes up is, what is authorship? And right now, if you write a book, you damn well want it to have your name on you want your name on the cover, and you say, this is my work. Whereas in reality, in the Renaissance, I think it's probably fair to say that authorship was conceived differently. There was no copyright. People would show up at other people's theaters. They'd write down what they saw. There was, people came and went. There's so little information about all of that, that the idea that there was this one individual who wrote every word in Shakespeare's plays and that could be conceived as a particular human, to me, is not all that credible. There were clearly, actors clearly had a role. Actors have always had a role in almost every era of the theater in what they, in writing things. I mean, in Hamilton, the musical, actors wrote some of that. That's ended up in a court of law. So, I mean, the theater is inherently collaborative. And you're absolutely right, though, that in the public theaters, which is where Shakespeare did the vast majority of his work, they were for-profit institutions, but they weren't free in the way we now think of them, because that wasn't Renaissance England. I mean, they upset the Queen, and you were not long for this world. So I wouldn't want to mythologize the freedom that provided, but it absolutely provided excitement for the audience. And it created, if you think of things like ghosts and fights and supernatural occurrences, these were all exciting to the Renaissance. The other thing that I always think that people forget is that not long ago, in the early days of Chicago, let's say Chicago around 1910, many people here, many ordinary people, not fancy University of Chicago people, ordinary people here, had a very deep understanding of Shakespeare. There were mass lectures, some of them sponsored by the University of Chicago, at big venues like Soldier Field, places like that, big venues where people would go to understand Shakespeare. So there was a point when the average person really had a pretty formidable, the average Chicagoan had a pretty formidable understanding of Shakespearean plays. And so that's also very, very interesting.
Well, I'm thinking of someone who's very close to the Graham School, David Bevington, as you're sharing that story, because he was the ultimate Shakespeare scholar and one who brought it to the public on a regular basis. Madison Bradshaw asked, how do you feel about the future of Shakespeare and the types of adaptations that are coming forward? And you mentioned one earlier related to Hamlet. She mentions like tabletop Shakespeare from Forced Entertainment, or the musical & Juliet, which I'll acknowledge I saw with my family. And it was an extraordinarily fun show. I'm not sure it was really a critique, because it was,
it was a riff,
right, of riff and fun. But yeah, what are your thoughts on those, and do those add to the legacy and impact, or do those critique it, or both? Curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, one of my dodgy answers to these questions is always, everything in the theater is on a case-by-case basis. That is almost always what I say, because I truly believe that to be the case. I'll say something more general, then I'll be like, oh, that doesn't apply in this instance. So I do think that it all depends on what the work is. Obviously, Shakespeare is in the public domain. The purpose of having things in the public domain is to allow other creative artists to make use of those texts in any way they want. And some people have been very creative in doing that. I was at Shakespeare and Company in the Berkshires earlier this summer, and there they've done sort of cuttings of plays where they've put together Shakespeare on Love, or Shakespeare's Women, or Shakespeare on War, and those can be wonderful pieces. I also think that the text for Shakespeare is no longer and should not be sacred. What I mean by that is, for a long period of time, directors would feel It's okay. I'm going to set it on the moon. I'm going to set it in this play. I'm going to set Romeo and Juliet in the 1960s. I'm going to do Hamlet in Chicago, but I cannot change a word. And really, there was a basic illogicality to that, because what you would always get, I felt when I reviewed it, was you get all this heavy concept at the beginning, maybe a dumb show, something like that. And then there would be this absolute desire to not skip any line. So then you would suddenly go back, the concept would slip away, then it would come right back before intermission, then it would go away, and it would come right back. And I'm like, well, look, if you want to mess with the play, there's no law against changing the text. There really isn't. There's no law against it. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it's very difficult to introduce other writers into Shakespearean landscapes, because, he was pretty good. He was pretty good. So sometimes it can be difficult. But Barbara Gaines at Chicago Shakespeare Theatre proved herself, sometimes controversially, but very adept, I always thought, at integrating other writers into Shakespeare and and I always thought that's a good thing. And every time I said that was a good thing, I would get letters from people telling me it was a very bad thing. So there's a lot of different opinions on that.
Jack Massa asked a question that quotes your course a few times. Can you say more about who in recent months has battered the bard by criticisms of his universality, and the new writers who have either riffed or undermined his works? And I know you've mentioned a few examples, but maybe any others that come to mind. And maybe just an addendum to this, you're going to be teaching this class. Maybe you could just give a little bit of insight into what that syllabus might look like and what you'll be reading both in Shakespeare and in some of the critique or riffing.
Well, I think we are going to try, as you did today. You can't really look at this without having a sort of a good basis in Shakespeare first. So I think we are going to sort of go for people who are interested in just learning a bit about, maybe would like to know more about Shakespeare, without all the meta stuff. I think we're going to start by looking at a tragedy, and particularly at Shakespeare's life and works, and really delve into 3 or 4 of the great plays. I imagine we'll delve into Lear. I think we'll delve into Hamlet. I think we'll look at one of the last plays. I think we'll look at least one comedy. So I think we will, and I think we'll look at what I like to think of as the plays that always cause trouble. Those are the sort of the controversial plays that are rooted in something that's very, very challenging for an audience today, like a play like Taming of the Shrew, for example, or a play like Othello, for example, or a play like Merchant of Venice, for example. Those are all very interesting. So we're going to sort of look at that. And then I think we will look, I think there is a sustained critique of Shakespeare that you can find throughout the media now. I think also you are seeing attempts to change particularly from a sort of Shakespeare as sexist point of view. If you look at the musical you mentioned on Broadway, and Juliet, which is it's a musical version of Romeo and Juliet, but it is not at all faithful to the Shakespearean original. It's essentially a deconstruction, if you like, of Shakespeare. And I think that has become quite common. Something Rotten is another Broadway show that did that. And as I mentioned, we'll certainly look at James I. James and the play Fat Ham, and a lot of other writers who are sort of using Shakespearean ideas to really get at the assumptions of it. And what I would hope is that we can wrestle a lot with the question of universal feeling. Yeah. I think in my work, that's the central problem. The central dilemma, I actually would argue it's the Central American dilemma at the moment. What's universal? What's universal about Americans? What's universal about this country? What can be agreed on? What do we all feel? Do we all feel anything? How do we deal with that? And is Shakespeare a representative of a particular POV, of a potentially repressive element, or is Shakespeare able to transcend that? And if you want Shakespeare to transcend that, what do you do? Do you just say, this is the play that must be seen in the context of its time? Or do you say, we have to in order to present Shakespeare in a way that works now, that creates universality, we have to do X, Y, and Z. And that's what I really want to explore in the class.
Fascinating and very interesting too to us in higher education, because if you look at the data, to the point that you made about how we no longer have some of these kind of universal beliefs, we see that one of the greatest dividing lines, and it's historically one that has grown over the last few decades, is between people of different education levels and the extent to which that has now shaped different understandings of America versus, a generation or two ago. Joe Page says Keats said Shakespeare displayed the enviable quality of negative capability, in quotes, in his work, not conveying his own opinions or personality, but exploring all of the human experience. I think this comes back to some of the self-effacing points you made earlier. And Joe wants to know, do you agree with Keats' statement?
That's a very difficult question, is my answer to that. I think in generally, I do. And as I mentioned, I do think that there was intentionality behind that, that the plays do reflect multiple points of view. And I think that Shakespeare went out of his way to avoid sort of if you like, partisan notions. And I think that is very, very central. That's very, very central to his work. And I think that is a sort of a remarkable thing. And that's why there's been sort of so many questions about Shakespeare's identity. Now, you could argue, if you're going to do a capitalist critique, let's say, I would say that Shakespeare was not immune to the demands of capitalism, otherwise known as butts in seats. That I do think you do see a writer who who was interested in the commercial imperative. And I also think that there's certainly scholars who have done this, who argue that he never really rocked the boat. And now you can argue that whenever we critique people from the past for not rocking the boat in the way we wish they had, we often overlook the danger of rocking the boat in previous eras. And that's not just an issue for Shakespeare, that's an issue, period, in the way we look at people in the past. So I do think that's true. But if you were to say, did Shakespeare intentionally avoid political partisanship, I would say yes. And I would say that was indeed intentional. And it's different from most playwrights now who don't make that same effort. And I think that there's also, I guess, an educator, Seth, would call it relative thinking. The idea that one of the things that students at great universities like the University of Chicago try and University of Chicago always wants to teach is relative thinking, the idea, complex thinking, the idea that two things can be true at once, for example. And I think that's a very important thing that Shakespeare did. The other thing I'd say, I sometimes find, and maybe everyone here can sympathize with me for a second for this, that as I get older, I sometimes see plays by young writers where I go, well, let's say there's a dilemma that is key and central to you when you're, say, 20, and this writer has written about that dilemma. And I sit there in the audience. This happened to me yesterday, actually. I sit there in the audience and I go, well, okay, I understand that's a dilemma at that moment. But as I look back on that era of my life, I had much the same issue and it all worked out okay. So there is that sense as you get a bit older that you're like, well, that's I guess what I'm trying to say is that questions of relative power retreat as you age. So as we age, we tend to turn our attention to things like loss. So one of my theories about my life now, at my age, is like my life will be dictated by how I handle loss. I really believe that to be true. And I see that with my friends. How well are they handling loss? And I think you can find a Shakespeare play for that, written as he got a little older. And I think that is a very important thing, that those plays, the plays that talk about mortality, about loss, and indeed about death and the meaning and the afterlife and the meaning of life and all of that, but particularly about how you navigate your life at various different stages. That you really can find that blueprint in these plays, I believe.
When it comes back to your case on some of the universal aspects, even if the entirety isn't
Yeah,
universal.
yeah.
Um, Tony Spencer, and this is coming back to your comment earlier, Chris, that you can do it on the moon, but you don't have to now be faithful to all the words. Asked, if you change the settings and the words, how is it still Shakespeare?
Great question. It's a case by case basis. I mean, that's the sort of slippery slope theory, right? That the moment you open the dam, the water is gonna rush through. I think that you can't see, if you are going to be in favor of that, you cannot see it in those terms. That would be my answer to that question. But I respect that question, and you know, do I lust for plays that change text? No, I don't. Do I think they have a right to change text? Yes, I do. So that's always, and I always go in there every night and go, well, let's see if it works. And the answer is sometimes it does and sometimes it does not.
Penelope has a question. Shakespeare and the liberal arts in general are now in decline. Do you see this
Yeah.
as cyclical, that at some time in the future, interests such as that you spoke of in the early 20th century will rise again? And maybe we can almost parse this into two questions. Do you think part of the challenge of Shakespeare is the challenge of the liberal arts? And then let's bring you into that broader liberal arts question of, will this be cyclical? Will it rise again as a field and as a way of thinking about humanity, which is getting to your broader humanistic point?
Well, I think humanity has progressed to the point where Shakespeare does and should have more competition on the curriculum. Like I don't think we'll ever go back to the point of sort of uh, a veneration quite in the way that was the case early in the 20th century. I don't, and I don't think we should. But that doesn't call for obliteration, and it doesn't call for removal. It calls for contextualization, but not contextualization that is ridiculous.
Right.
So I think that Shakespeare still remain. It's very difficult to think of a peer, and I think that wherever you go in the world, there is a sort of an acceptance of that, and even those folks who maybe feel otherwise and have the right to so feel, I think they often are able to. They're often are able to. Shakespeare can be a starting place for other people's imaginations. It's a little bit like a teacher who then spawns, whose students become teachers themselves and who teach completely different courses.
Yeah.
I think most teachers worth their salt are delighted when that happens, even if in fact the younger teacher is uh, critiquing the older teacher.
Right.
There's still a sense that that is the way the world goes. And I do think things are cyclical to some extent, and that things come and go, and that I like to think we will move back into a more tolerant era, and and a richer vein of complex thinking. I do see that as to some extent a pandemic casualty, where we all got out of the habit of relative thinking a little bit and everything became very much reduced to polarities. I see it as a lamentable political development as well. And I like to think that we will return to, more liberal thinking in the non-political sense. And I really believe that is vital, because at the end of the day, nations are dependent on shared interests. They are on shared feelings and shared values. And so wrestling with what we share is, for me, it's the central job of the University of Chicago. It is the central job. It's the central job of the Graham School and of the liberal arts. What do we share? What holds us together? What else is more important to think about than that?
Well, it is time, but it's also a beautiful point to end on. I think
Thank
at
you.
our greatest, we would be that opportunity for people to really discern what we share, and then to think about how that plays out in society. And we believe, as you know well, because you're part of our world, that the liberal arts are the foundation on which that inquiry happens, because it is that human experience across time and space that allows us to reflect on those big questions in a way that is both timeless and timely. And so, Chris, thank you. I will share that I have been flooded with notes from people that are so excited about this class, and also people that are from all over the world who are asking, will it ever come online in the future
Oh,
beyond this quarter at Gleacher?
maybe.
So I will just give you the knowledge that we would love to have that happen for those who are asking, because we think this is a global topic, certainly, and we'd love to engage all of the people that want to endeavor it. But this autumn, for those who want to be part of this in a deeper way,
Live and in person.
live and in person at the Gleacher Center in downtown Chicago, where Chris has played such a vital role in our city and in the thinking of our future for it. So, Chris, thank you.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
all for joining us. And for those in Chicago, stay dry. It's raining outside of all of us right now.
Thank you,
Have good
everybody.
afternoons.